Paul the Apostle, originally born Saul, was a Christian preacher who had a large role in spreading Christianity in the 1st century AD. Saul was born in AD 6 and grew up in a devout Jewish family in the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. Saul was a Pharisee, which was a member of an ancient Jewish sect that strictly obeyed the law of Moses. By the year 30, Paul was a Pharisee, and his family were very attached to the Pharisaic traditions for generations, coming from one of the best rabbinic schools in Jerusalem. He was that devout that he became a part of Judaism's council of rabbis, the Sanhedrin, in the year 31. During the years 30 to 33, Christianity was developing in Israel. Saul spent much of the first half of his life persecuting the new Christian movement. Saul believed that the Jews that were following Jesus had given into idolatrous practices, punishable by ostracisms and light floggings. As a devout Jew, Paul thought that claiming Jesus was the Messiah was blasphemous. In the year 34, Paul ventured from Jerusalem to Damascus with a mandate from the high priest of Judaism to find and arrest followers of Jesus. The Jewish intention was to return them as prisoners and potentially for execution. The Jews were spiteful towards the Christians because they were teaching against the law of Moses, which had been the Jewish norm for 1400 years. The Jews also saw the rise of Christianity as a threat to the peace of their community, placing pressure on their recruitment areas. During his venture to Damascus, Saul was interrupted when he was blinded by a bright light and was spoken to by a divine voice. The voice said that it was Jesus. He commanded Saul to go into Damascus. Saul stood up, opened his eyes, but could not see anything for 3 days. Saul now had chosen Jesus as his Messiah. Following his new guidelines, he travelled with a few men and continued into Damascus. Upon his return to Damascus, Saul begins preaching the word of Christ and the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. While in Damascus, Saul did not obey the Jewish high priest, and 3 years later, he returned to Jerusalem to be acquainted with the leading apostles there. In the year 36, Saul fled Damascus following persecution from the Jews. The Jewish Sanhedrin knew of Saul's Christian preachings, and his life was threatened by the Jews, and he escaped in a basket, being lowered down through the city walls. He resided in Jerusalem in the same year and met with the apostles. The apostles believed that it was in the best interests of Saul to return to his home city of Tarsus to ensure safety for the time being. During the years 36 to 44, Saul preaches in Tarsus and its surrounding regions. In the year 46, Saul is invited by Barnabas, the Cypriot Jew, to preach around Gentile cities in the known world. The first city Saul and Barnabas preached in was in Antioch. Saul and Barnabas continued spreading the word for 1 year until both men were sent to Jerusalem in 44 AD. They used the contributions from the church at Antioch to aid poorer Christians in Judea. Barnabas and Saul conducted their first mission trip in 48 to Cyprus, leaving from the port in Seleucia. They were accompanied by their new recruit, the evangelist John Mark, in the same year. Saul and Barnabas faced many difficulties preaching to the Cypriots, with Saul being tied to a pillar and being lashed 39 times by the Jews. However, Saul was eventually successful, converting the Roman governor Sergius Paulus to Christianity and establishing Cyprus as one of the world's first Christian states. Following Saul's success at Cyprus, he officially becomes Paul of Tarsus. Paul, Barnabas and John Mark all leave Cyprus and head for Persia and Pamphylia in southern, modern-day Turkey. John Mark left Barnabas and Paul following their fear of persecution in Persia. Both Paul and Barnabas continued on to another city called Antioch, but this time in Pisidia. Paul struggles to preach to the Jews in Antioch and decides that from now on he will only continue preaching to Gentiles. Paul and Barnabas continue heading east into Iconium. Once again, they are met with strong resilience from Jews. Paul and Barnabas left Iconium following fears of being stoned and head to Lystra in the south. The Gentiles in Iconium mistaken Barnabas for Zeus and Paul for Hermes incarnate after the two healed a crippled man in the name of Jesus Christ. At this time, the known world was Hellenized, with Greek pagan beliefs being institutional at this time. The local Jewish leaders wanted to stone Paul to death for supernatural acts that were allegedly through the power of Christ. Paul and Barnabas were able to escape to a nearby city called Derbe, east of Lystra. In the year 47, Paul heads to the north of Turkey and resides at Anatolia. Following their brief stay at Anatolia, Paul and Barnabas arrive back at Antioch. They find some men in their church preaching to the Gentiles that they must be circumcised under the law of Moses to be legitimate Christians. Paul and Barnabas were confused by this theological issue and consulted the apostles back in Jerusalem in 49 AD. At this Jerusalem council, James and the apostles decide Gentiles do not have to follow the Jewish traditions like circumcisions to be Christians. After leaving Barnabas and Paul, John Mark looked to reunite with the evangelical duo. Barnabas was supportive of John Mark's return, but Paul believed that John Mark was untrustworthy and was still bitter about his retreat. Paul left Barnabas and instead left with Silas and a young man called Timothy. The group of 3 men headed towards Bithynia, but according to the New Testament, they were divinely guided to Troas. From Troas, they sailed across to Neapolis after a Macedonian man called to them across the Aegean. Paul believed that this was a message sent by Jesus Christ. They continued their journey to Philippi, where Paul and his followers are placed in prison for their first time. Paul and his followers were singing and full of joy in their prison, believing that the Spirit of God was with them. According to the Christian texts, an earthquake occurs and Paul's cell door opens alongside his bonds. They flee Philippi and head to Thessaloniki, Berea, and then Athens, where Paul preaches on Athens' famous political discussion platform, the Areopagus. The Athenians did not take Paul seriously, and he was laughed out from the city. They flee to the city of Corinth, where Paul writes his letters to the church of Thessaloniki, giving us 1 and 2 Thessalonians in the New Testament. After a year and a half, they leave Corinth and head to Jerusalem. Paul's preaching had not finished. He had set out for his third mission in 53 AD. He ventured back to Ephesus, where he spent 3 years in a church that he had planted. On his way, he revisits all the churches in Asia Minor that he had previously established. From Ephesus, he writes his letters to the Corinthians. In Ephesus, Paul receives a lot of his support for his teachings, but upon his departure, the city falls into chaos and disorder. This is because the New Testament tells us that while he was in Ephesus, he performed many miracles and many baptisms for the people there. In the city of Troas, Paul presents a sermon causing a young boy to fall from a window to his death. However, through the power of Christ, Paul is able to raise him back from the dead. He continues venturing throughout Greece, writing his letters to the Galatians and the Romans over his 4-year-long journey. Paul makes his last stop at a city called Miletus and calls the leaders of the church in Ephesus to meet him there. In Miletus, Paul believed that God wanted him to return to Jerusalem, where he would meet his end at the festival of the Passover. The festival of the Passover was very important for the Jews, as it commemorated the Hebrews' liberation of slavery in Egypt. Paul returned to Jerusalem, and the Sanhedrin were disgusted and furious with Paul's work over the last few years, believing that he was preaching treacherous and blasphemous teachings. The Jews, under the guidance of the Sanhedrin, arrested Paul in the temple, and he was taken to Caesarea under arrest. In 59 AD, the procurator Festus takes over the Council of Judea. Paul appealed this, sending him to Rome as a result. While heading to Rome, he was still under arrest for 1 whole year. He began writing some of his most influential works, like Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians, while still held in jail. At the end of his arrest, he is freed and sets forth for Macedonia, empowering the churches that he had established earlier in the 1st century AD. By the year 62, Nero is the emperor of Rome, and was one of the most anti-Christian emperors in the history of the Roman Empire. Ancient evidence tell us that the Emperor Nero used Christians as human torches, as a form of punishment. In the year 64, Rome was burned and the Emperor Nero blamed Christians. He demanded that Paul be arrested for the destruction of the city. Paul was chained and beheaded before Nero during the years 64 and 66 AD. Paul is often considered to be the most important person in Christianity after Jesus. His epistles have had an enormous influence on Christian theology, especially on the relationship between God the Father and Jesus.